Our next two speakers are Lisa Hofflich and Denise Murphy-McGraw, co-chairwomen of the New York State Public Affairs Committee of the Junior League.
Good afternoon, Senator Hassel-Thompson and members of the Senate. We will be discussing with you the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. My name is Lisa Hofflich, and I am the co-chair of the New York State Public Affairs Committee of the Junior Leagues. I'm here with my co-chair, Denise Murphy-McGraw, and our colleague, Dana Dearson-Buer. Together, we represent the 18 junior leagues across New York State, comprised of over 8,000 women voters. As such, the junior leagues of New York State join the Coalition for Women Prisoners, the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and hundreds of organizations across the state in urging you to support the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, sponsored by Assemblymember Jeffrey Aubrey and Senator Ruth Hassel-Thompson. This legislation, which has gained statewide support with our members, will begin to address years of injustice faced by survivors caught in the criminal justice system whose lives have been shattered by domestic abuse. Junior leagues are constantly working on ways to improve the lives of women and children. This year, as part of our work, we have advocated in support of legislation helping statewide efforts that would ensure victims of domestic violence have a voice. We believe that legislation such as this warrants review and approval, and, if passed, would go a long way to enhancing the lives of women and children affected by this critical issue. For this reason, we sponsored a lobby day in support of the DVSJA, which was attended by more than 50 women from throughout the state who met with their legislators to discuss the importance of the measure. We also held a press conference that captured the statewide attention of media outlets throughout the state, such as New York Now and Gannett and New York One. These women also went home and educated their own local junior leagues about the need for passage of the bill as soon as possible. All too often, when a survivor defends herself, our criminal justice system responds with harsh punishment instead of with compassion and assistance. Much of this punishment is a result of our state's current sentencing structure, which does not allow judges the discretion to fully consider the impact of domestic violence when determining sentencing lengths. This can lead to long and unfair prison sentences for many survivors. As you have already heard, the DVSJA would address the problem by allowing judges the discretion to apply for shorter prison terms, and in some cases, alternative to incarceration sentencing. Detractors of the bill state that its language is overly broad and would allow for people convicted of crimes against innocent victims to abuse the system. We in the Junior League believe this to be factually false. The bill does, in fact, open up alternative sentences to a much wider range of survivors. It would apply to those who harm their abusers directly and those who engage in other illegal acts to protect themselves from their abuser's violence. However, the opposition's assertion that this bill would open the floodgates to anyone who wants to claim a physical or psychological abuse when they commit an illegal act is, in itself, abusive of the bill's intent. The bill explicitly states that in order to be eligible for alternate DV sentencing, 1, the defendant must have been a victim of the domestic violence at the time the crime was committed, and 2, that the abuse was a significant contributing factor to the crime. Thus, for example, a person who was abused and then convicted of a crime 1 or 2 or 20 years later is not eligible for alternative sentencing under this bill. We in the Junior League believe that eligibility for shorter prison terms and alternatives to incarceration for women survivors is particularly appropriate, as they most often have no past criminal record, no history of violence, and extremely low recidivism rates. Of the 38 women convicted of murder and released between 1985 and 2003, not a single one returned to prison for a new crime within a 36-month period of release. That's a 0% recidivism rate. Community-based alternative to incarceration programs are less costly and far more effective than prison in allowing survivors to rebuild relationships with their families. They are able to recover from their abuse and take responsibility while positively participating in their communities. Allowing mothers to live in the community while serving their sentences also permits them to maintain ties to their children, and that lessens the trauma of separation. Doing so would thereby increase the likelihood that their own children will receive the support that they need in order to become productive and healthy adults. With no compromise to public safety, the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act will help New York address years of injustice suffered by survivors who are given harsh penalties for acting to protect themselves and their families. It will decrease the likelihood that survivors will be re-victimized, this time by the very system that should have protected them in the first place. On behalf of the Junior Leagues of New York State and the 8,000 women that we represent, we urge you to support the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. We see it as critical legislation for survivors of domestic violence, as well as all community members in your district and across the state. Thank you.
I have very little to add. I could not say it better than my colleague said, other than to say I know many of you know me from my work here in Albany every day. I just want to point out that the Junior Leaguers are all volunteer. They come from throughout the state to Albany once a year, sometimes more often. Obviously today they came here entirely volunteer. All their public affairs work is as volunteers to go into the district offices, as we did this fall with you, Senator Hassel-Thompson, and they become involved in public action because it is a passion. Over the past few years, they've been involved in activities such as childhood obesity and combating that. They've been involved in trying to combat other heinous acts in this state as human trafficking. And it has been because of the strength of this conference and supporting us and hearings such as this and roundtables such as this that we've been able to be stronger as a public affairs committee. So I'm very grateful for this roundtable today and being able to hear us as a public affairs committee and taking on the Domestic Violence Act. It is very important. We're very grateful for the work of Women in Prison Project and our partners there, and we hope that we'll be successful this year because this is a vitally important piece of legislation to us. So thank you all very much for hearing us today.
How supportive has district attorney's offices been with supporting these alternative programs to incarceration? Do you get any support from them, or? I know you've met with them.
There has been a response from the State District Attorneys Association that they have some issues with this particular bill, but I do not know exactly what their response is to the ATI programs.
I'd like to indicate to you, Senator Sampson, that the DAs from around the state were invited to participate today, and they respectfully declined. But I don't want you to feel uncomfortable, put on the spot by having to answer that, only because you've got to keep relationships with those DAs. I don't. You know, and from the perspective that we have received pushback from them constantly on this particular bill, but I think that part of the hearing today is to allow them and others to understand the breadth of the focus and the concern that we're asking them to readdress. I think that what each person who has spoken today has continued to reiterate is that this is not an issue of public safety, but it is an issue of justice.
No, and I would agree. And the reason I asked that question is because I know in Brooklyn, my district, D.A. Hines has the Family Justice Center, and he's done a lot of outreach with respect to domestic violence victims.
Working in the communities, absolutely.
Working in the community with respect to that. And that's I asked about it. There were other DAs who put forth, because he's always looking for all these alternative sentencing programs to help out individuals in those instances.
And we have a very active junior league in Brooklyn, and we'll have them make that connection with DA Hines, and maybe through your office, because you've always been so helpful. So thank you, Senator.
No problem.
And I think we have one in Queens County, too.
We have one in Westchester, but our DA has been the most vocal against this bill. I'd like to put that on the record. I thank you.
Thank
you.
you.